there a little feedback? Does it sound like there's feedback from the mic? Okay, sounds good. Okay. So I just wanted to go through, I guess, last week. Who was here last week for the class on the confessions? Okay, you two weren't. All right, so I'll maybe speak a little bit to last week. Last week, Pastor Mike talked a little bit about the confessions in general and the ones that were not going to be included for this upcoming, for consideration at ECO. I guess I'll just start in the beginning. One way to think of a confession is just the corporate statement of beliefs. They've variously been called symbols, creeds, statements of faith, witness of the church. So people get together and they, sometimes a big group, as in the case of Westminster Standards, or sometimes a small group, as the Scots Confession is. They get together and they decide, let's talk about what the confessions mean, right? And so right now the ECO Church, the PCUSA had 11 now confessions, and ECO is thinking about reducing that to about 7 confessions. And they're pretty much getting rid of all the modern confessions. There was one written during Nazi times to sort of address the threat of Nazism, the rise of Nazism in Europe. And there was one written in 1967 to address some of the Protestant social thinking. So the rise of industrialization, the urbanization of our countries and our culture gave rise to a whole host of ethical concerns that most of the Christian world wrote about, acknowledged, sort of thought about deeply, and had ethical prescriptions for. And what has happened is we've eliminated those. They're proposing that we eliminate those modern ones in ECO. And my goal here today is actually to just give you sort of a basis of what the confessions are, what they were for, maybe tell you a little bit about the confessions that we're considering, and actually get your feedback, because they want all the ECO churches, they want me to go back and tell them what our congregation thinks. Now, they basically want to know if you're good with the confessions that they've chosen, and whether they should consider, last week Pastor Laura said maybe they would write one, maybe ECO would write one. Now that's a huge undertaking. Or maybe they would adopt another one that was either in the PCUSA Book of Confessions, or there are confessions outside of PCUSA that different Reformed denominations have adopted. So you can stop me at any time if you have any questions about what I'm saying. So I'd say that the most basic and original confession, one way to think about these is Jesus Christ is Lord. It's a witness to the fact that we believe what makes us unique is that Jesus Christ is Lord. Now that's biblical. So there are levels of authority within the church. One way to think of it is, God would be the first authority, God and Jesus. And then a second authority would be what's in the Bible. And a third level of authority would be the confessions. And the great thing about Reformed tradition is it's not necessarily just Reformed. One way to think of it is it's reforming. So the PCUSA, and I would think ECO leadership would say, they are authoritative in their own way, the confessions, but they're not as authoritative as the Bible. Let's say if there's something biblical or something, there are higher levels of authority, is what they would say. And so one way to think of it is that that these can always be reformed, and they will always be reforming. And that's one important part of our church, is that we're always looking for new ways to invite God into our lives, to think about the way that our church lives out the gospel. And so the ones that they're considering, I'll just go through them real quick, and if you have any questions or comments about them as I go through them, please let me know. The first one that they're considering the most historical is the Scots Confession. So one way to think of it is I like to think of now look, I'm not an expert. I read one book on the confession, so Pastor Laura, Mike, please stop me if I'm going off the reservation. But one way I like to think of it is, the Reformed Church has been under a lot of persecution at this time. This is 1560, I want to say. Is that right? Let me find it. Yeah, 1560. And so John Knox and some English-speaking Scots are influenced by the continental European Reformed movement, John Calvin and the folks in continental Europe, and he wants to start this. And he's actually suffered a lot because of his adoption of the Reformed tradition. So he's in Scotland, and he's asked to write, along with a few of his colleagues, the Scots Confession. And so this is like the battle flag of our tradition. This is like, and Pastor Mike talked about it last week a little bit. This is very seriously critical of the Catholic faith, and I don't think any of us here would probably want to be that critical. I mean, I think they called it a harlot at some point in there, something like that. Like the Catholicism is, it's pretty seriously critical, and that's because they've suffered a lot for their faith at this time. And then the Westminster, which was adopted 100 years later in 1647, started in 1643, was more of the Scots Confession is like the battle flag, and the Westminster Standards are more like the regular flag of their nation, of their denomination. So you can think of it like in the Confederacy, they had a regular flag for the Confederacy, and they had a battle flag. And so the Scots Confession is the battle flag, and the Westminster Standard is more like the national flag. It's more conciliatory. It's actually, the Westminster Standards was formed to standardize the beliefs of what they thought was the English, the British Isles, all their reform. So there were reform movements all over the British Isles, and it was supposed to unify them under one sort of standard. And it was commissioned at the time. There was a lot of upheaval at the time. It was during war, actually, and so despite that, I mean, if you read through it, I mean, it's very long. The Westminster Catechisms, they go into minute detail about different aspects of the faith. I think there are denominations that actually do just the Westminster Standard. Who is it? PCA? Is the PCA only? Oh, really? So that's all they use. And it's probably enough. Now, I think it's interesting that we use multiple confessions, because I think it gives us a broader sense of the history of the Reformed tradition. So one other catechism that they're proposing we adopt is the Heidelberg Catechism, which is a continental catechism. It comes from Europe, obviously Heidelberg, right? And what makes it interesting, it was very influential in the Scots Confession. They were contemporary with each other. 1563 was the Heidelberg Confession. 1560 was the Scots, or the Heidelberg Catechism. 1560 was the Scots Confession. And the Heidelberg Catechism was the first that was adopted in America. It was the one that they brought over first. It was the first one that Reformed colonial people in the New World used. And so I think it's interesting that they've decided to use the Heidelberg Catechism. I think that fits with our English-speaking Presbyterian tradition, in that it was the first one that was brought over to the New World by colonial Americans. The Scots Confession obviously was the first one in the British Isles, and then the Westminster Standards is sort of the standard bearer that most Presbyterian traditions subscribe to. Then, of course, there are the creeds that they... so the Westminster Confessions, it was written by Puritan clergymen in the Church of England, and it was adopted in America in 1729 by Presbyterians. And it goes very in-depth. And so I guess, so those are the three, the Westminster has the catechism, the shorter catechism, the longer catechism, and the confession. So it's actually 3 in 1. The Heidelberg Catechism is one that they're proposing we adopt, and also the Scots Confession. And then, of course, the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed. So those are the main ones that they have submitted to us for consideration, and that I am asked to go report back to them on. They've eliminated the Second Helvetic, which, according to my book, is by theologians they love, but according to Pastor Mike and Pastor Laura, it's one of the hardest ones. So theologians love it. I'm not sure laity in the church are so enamored with it. It is harder to read. It is very, you almost have to be a theology student. So there's some merit to that. But again, I think if we're going to choose a continental confession, Heidelberg is easier to read, and it's also one that was adopted early in the English-speaking tradition. So I think in that sense, it probably fits better if we were going to choose between the Second Helvetic and the Heidelberg. I can see why they may have chosen the Heidelberg. Again, they did get rid of the Barmen, is that the one that's the 30s that was written under Nazism? And then 1967 really had some social justice aspects. And Protestant social teaching, Catholic social teaching, again, like I said, was something that was important to a lot of different traditions, and they sort of incorporated it in the 1967 in the PCUSA in their confession that they wrote. It was the first that they had really written in a long time. And so that's something maybe, I don't know what you all think. Is that something that's important, social justice? I mean, I don't want to say social justice because I know that maybe among us, because we're kind of conservative, has a negative connotation, but social justice in the best sense of the word, that we care about, our neighbors in the modern world with modern concerns, with concerns that are different than they were 200 years ago. Now we've got urbanized cities, we've got, culture that has people from, we're really a melting pot. We have a lot of different cultures that we're approaching. We have people who have been oppressed. I mean, we have women and minorities who have been oppressed for a long time. And 1967 that confession approaches those concerns. And we don't really have something. So do you think we should adopt it? I mean, you probably have to read the 1967 confession to get an idea of whether we should adopt it, or is there some talk about writing some?
There is, yeah.
Or one.
I think there are people who are really concerned about losing C67 because it's the only place that talks about racial justice. On the other hand, the way that confession talks about the Bible has always angered evangelicals.
Right.
Because it says the Word of God is Jesus, and the Bible points to the Word of God, rather than saying the Bible is the Word of God. Now, we've decided in ECO that our essential tenets control how we receive the confessions. So even if we keep C67, we're still saying what our essential tenets say about the Bible. But we would be continuing to have a statement that talks about racial reconciliation, for instance. So that's one argument for keeping it. Other people will say, better that we write our own statement about some of these pressing issues that doesn't have things we have to disagree with. And then some other people say there are other statements, like there's the Lausanne Covenant, which is an evangelical covenant, a global covenant that's agreed to by many evangelicals that talks more about social justice issues. So those are kind of the three options. We keep C67, we write something of our own, or we adopt something else that's already out there. I don't hear anybody saying we should just not even talk about those things.
Right.
I think we need to talk about these things, but how?
Is there a discussion about the authority concerns? That's something that was interesting to me, that PCUSA sort of sets out in their book of confessions that they're going to, that there is a certain amount of authority, and then they undo all the authority that the confessions have. They go in there and they say, well, really, we're reformed and reforming, and we're not going to say what you have to agree with and what you don't. We're just trying to have a really big tent. Is there some idea that we might be able to assemble this and also put our own eco-introduction that would say what level of authority we're holding these to? Because I think it's like PCUSA in general. They're trying to have such a big tent that they're doing away with any sort of like standards. They're saying you can disagree with any part of the confessions that you want, but we also think these are authoritative in some sense, and it's sort of like, well, what are we supposed to think about that? Is there?
Yeah, I think a couple years ago I was traveling around ECO saying we don't know what kind of confessionalists we are. We're still figuring that out, and we need to figure this out. But eventually, the other members of the Theology Task Force, we had a meeting where we all sat down and we hashed this out, several meetings actually. And one person in particular said, look, I've taken out everything from our polity that talks about our confessions. And you can kind of build a chain, and it tells us what kind of authority we're committed to. We don't have to figure this out. ECO has already decided. We are essential tenets subscriptionists, which means that if you're an officer, the only thing you say I must agree with is the essential tenets. So, for instance, there are places in our confessions, especially in Second Helvetic, but I think in other places too, that say women should not be ministers. We keep those documents, but we say, our tenets say, we believe in the equality of men and women in every office. So that trumps the statement in the confessions.
Okay. And would we write something in an introduction,
Yes.
sort of like about that?
We
Okay.
already have started. We
Okay.
don't even know what we're an introduction to, but
Right.
we've got one young guy on our task force who's a very good writer, and he said, we need something more narrative, less dogmatic, that kind of tells our story and talks about how these documents function in our story and what they do for us, and the authority that comes out of them and how they connect us to the broader Reformed Presbyterian world. And he's writing that.
Okay.
He's
Yeah.
already started.
So that looks like it's heading towards a new confession model?
Well, no, that will be an introduction to our new book, whatever we decide is going to be
Just
in
as
that.
an introduction.
So, but I think it'll be a fairly substantial introduction
Yeah.
that will set some context.
There was a question, I think, at one time that we were concerned that if we eliminate some of the confessions, we eliminate the basis for
Right.
some of the statements in the essential tenets. And as you mentioned, in fact, we might have to, if we do that, they might have to write a new confession to
Right.
make sure that that's covered.
So there's a difference of opinion about that, even within the task force. So some people think we need a new confession to kind of shore up. If you get that booklet, there's a chart that shows every idea in the tenets and what supports it. There are a couple lines that have no support, which freaked me out actually when I first saw that chart. But most things have support in the Book of Confessions, many of them in multiple places. But if you take out something like the equality of women in every office, if you take out the brief statement of faith, which is the place that supports that, do we have to take it out of the essential tenets? No, we do not have to take it out of the essential tenets. Do we need to adopt something new at a confessional level? Or are we just saying, well, the support for that's the Bible?
Right.
So we have both those views
Yeah.
rattling around in the task force right now. But I think we'll find out. The tenets are not up for debate. The tenets are authoritative. They're part of our Constitution, and that's not what we're discussing. So they remain the guideline right now. There is some discussion. I think that there's a motion, an overture coming from a church in Florida to turn the essential tenets into There are various ways people are thinking about doing this.
What do you think about that idea?
It freaks me out.
Right.
What do you think about the idea of the essential tense?
Well, it frightens me on one level because I was the first writer of it. It makes me crazy. But it also, I think then we're not doing essential tenet subscription. I think it complicates then the role of the other confessions.
Right.
How do they function? If the essential tenets is a confession among confessions, then in what sense is it our essential tenets? I think it's confusing myself. I think it's better to leave it as our essential tenets document.
What I want to hear from y'all is mainly, we came to ECO because of questions of biblical authority. I mean, these authority questions were really important to us. That's why many of us left. I know that's true for me. I know that's true for Pastor Laura. I don't know if it's true for most of you, but I would like to hear to what extent you think these are important for questions of authority. I mean, even with the Bible, there are things that are central and things that are peripheral. And that's one function of confessions. They help us grapple with these things. And so what do you think, what level of authority are these? Obviously, we have essential tenets as well. Have any of you looked at these? Do you care about them? One thing that's important is that, many times in the PCUSA, pastors, when they're ordained, sort of profess that these are authoritative, that the confessions are authoritative. And I don't know, is that true of ECO? Are we ordaining people with that?
We receive, adopt, and are bound by the essential tenets. There's also a place where we say, and it's not just pastors, it's others, we'll be guided by the confessions.
Okay.
So we receive, adopt, and are bound by the essential tenets. We're guided by the confessions.
Did any of you grow up in the Presbyterian Church and go to, when you were 13 years old, classes on Presbyterianism and sort of learn about the faith, the history of the faith?
Yeah.
What is that?
Catechism.
Right, okay.
I don't remember anything.
Right. So some of those classes are guided by the catechisms.
It was a long time ago.
Let me take my mind to Presbyterian of East Africa. You only have two: the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and then the Catechism. They realize we cannot even know about the Heidelberg and all these things.
Yeah.
Which catechism?
Just Scots.
Oh, Scott.
Scott's confession. Okay.
So anything else, we couldn't even master and know what they're all about. So when the forefathers, when we had the Presbyterian Church established in 19something, they came up with only those two: the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed. And members don't know anything about anything below that.
Right.
Other than that. So when I came here, I'm hearing about all these things. I have no idea what they are.
Well, they have a different function than the creeds, right? The creeds say we are Christians like Christians all around the world. We share these with Methodists, with Lutherans, with people of all different backgrounds. From 3 on down say, and this is what our family thinks.
Right.
Our Presbyterian Reformed family thinks. So it's a different job to say what's unique to our family versus what do we share with Christians everywhere in the world.
One of the concerns that I have is that for the average church member, they don't read the confessions. They haven't read the book of confessions. They're only familiar with them in passing.
Right.
It's almost of an academic interest. And I think the best effort we can make to reduce the number of documents and numbers of confessions, the better chance we have of encouraging church members to read what we have. Because right now, I don't know how I managed to do it, but in a period of about a year, I read the book of Confessions. And it was hard, tough going. I'm going to tell you, because a lot of the language is very archaic, would be my term for it. It's very old, and it's very difficult to understand.
So what do you think? Do you think that's even, we're considering maybe too many even?
I'm not so sure the EPC hasn't got it right.
Right.
I think they recognize the two creeds and the Westminster family of confession.
Right.
And let it go at that. Personally, I think that's
Can I say
enough.
something as just a regular old churchgoer and not an elder?
Yeah.
I think it's very confusing.
Yeah.
I think the fact that we have essential tenants is terrific. I mean, that alone, we can get all our church members to read through those a couple of times and understand them and feel good about what they say about our faith. I think we've accomplished a lot.
So when you say it's confusing, is it because there's so much, or because you think they don't all agree, or?
All of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Too much, they don't all agree.
You know, I've not been a regular churchgoer all my life, but I have been from a child knowing and into it. I took part of the Heidelberg Catechism. I knew nothing about the Scots or the Westminster. I knew the Apostles' Creed and Nicene Creed and all that stuff. The rest of it means absolutely nothing. It doesn't. What I know is that regular church girl need to know is what are the basics of the church? What are we reading?
Right.
What are we for?
I went through catechism and confirmation in the Presbyterian Church, and we didn't read any of the confessions other than the Apostles' Creed, and we were required to memorize the Apostles' Creed.
Right.
And I remember it today. But that's all that's stuck.
Yeah.
And that's just my thought on that.
Sure.
I think we have to recognize, are we doing this for the theologians, or are we doing it for the
Well, I think
church members?
And I think there is something to that. I think we are doing it partially for the theologians. We have been a tradition that has traditionally been very well educated. I mean, PCUSA used to require, postgraduate degrees of all their pastors, which kind of sets us apart from a lot of Protestant traditions. And those people have been formed by these confessions. So I think part of it is for theologians. I mean, that's a big part of the reason why we have it.
The pastor is a theologian in the local church, right? That that's what the pastor's supposed to be. And so certainly requiring pastors to know our heritage seems like a reasonable thing to require. But also, I don't know, when I was a kid, and certainly when my parents were children, the churches that I was part of, the elders were equally well informed about the confessional standards of the church. And I do think that that is possible, to have a world in which the elders, but then I think we have to offer support. And the Theology Task Force is going to move into doing more educational resources once we know which of these do we love and care for. And one thing would be, let's get some modern English versions of the Westminster Standards. I mean,
Sure.
we don't need to wade through 17th century or 18th century English in order to understand what's in the Westminster. Let's put some modern English stuff out there. Let's get the modern English translation of the Heidelberg Catechism that's already been done by the Christian Reformed Church, which is much easier going and very beautiful. And let's start using some of this stuff in worship, using it liturgically, and so these words become comfortable to us. I think that we would start getting that kind of support once we know what we're doing.
Right.
But you're right, it's too big to support the whole thing, I think, all 11.
I'm in agreement. I hear your pain. It is difficult, and the more of this there is, the less likely we are to use it. So, listening to all this and kind of brainstorming with all of you, I'm more inclined to say, 1 and 2 are essentially necessary. If you kept 3 and 4, you'd get rid of 6, 7, and 8. But 6, 7, and 8 are really, you don't want to sort of copy OPC, EPC, but they're onto something. So if you kept 6, 7, and 8, you could even set aside 3 and 4. So you become 1, 2, 6, 7, and 8, and then write our own that would replace the 20th century, the 9, 10, and 11. So you'd end up with 1, 2, 6, 7, and 8 in the new one, which makes it a little more manageable. You're right, there are modern language for Westminster with study guides and all that.
I think that then one function of the confessions is also ecumenical. It has to do with our connections with other denominations and our role in the world communion of Reformed churches. Our only formal ecumenical partner besides the WCRC, which lots of people are part of that, including the PCUSA. They're not thrilled, though, about being our ecumenical partner, but they're there. And so is the CRC. But we have a particular relationship with the CRC still at this point. So we share with them the Heidelberg Catechism. We share with the EPC. We're friendly with the EPC. We haven't made any formal arrangements. We share the Westminster Standards. I think if we start losing too many confessions, see, this is what I hear from people in some other parts of the country. They'll say, you're losing to the EPC. Do you not understand that? They're winning people over because they take the confession seriously and you don't. You're a Presbyterian light. That's what you are. You don't bother to teach the real doctrine of the Presbyterian tradition. I, for one, don't really like that reputation. I would prefer to not hand ammunition to people who are already saying that about ego. I'm constantly fighting to make sure that the evangelical part of us doesn't overwhelm the Reformed part, that we don't become just one more non-denominational evangelical group with no particular Presbyterian identity. And I think confirming some of this Presbyterian heritage is one way to anchor ourselves in that tradition. But then we do have to teach it.
Listen, I want to ask you, if you don't mind, in sort of layman's terms, would you give us a definition of Reformed and a definition of evangelical?
Oh, wow.
Okay,
Okay, so Reformed is usually the word used for the branch of the Reformation that came from John Calvin. So there's a Lutheran branch, there's a branch that comes through Zwingli, and then the Anabaptists, and a lot of things happen from that. And then there's the Reformed branch. Presbyterians are part of the Reformed branch. A lot of churches that have Reformed in their name. There are some Reformed Baptists. Anglicans were part of that Reformed branch. So it's a fairly big branch. The World Communion of Reformed Churches has churches all around the world. Not many Anglicans. They've kind of become so big, they're their own communion. But a lot of those other churches are part of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. So it's a family that kind of goes back to John Calvin and it's gotten broader. So we haven't all gone down the same path. Evangelical.
Just one or two distinctives, maybe, like election, perhaps.
So election is often lifted up as a big distinctive of the Reformed tradition, but of course Catholics believe in election too. Lutherans believe in election too. So John Calvin has a very, what I consider kind of a harsh view of election and predestination. And frankly, most people in the Presbyterian Reformed tradition do not follow Calvin on that. Westminster Standards sort of do. That's one reason to have Scots there as well, to allow for multiple views of predestination, so that we can be single predestinarians, not required to be double predestinarians. So that's often seen as kind of central for us. I think Reformed tradition is a very strong view of sin, but again, we share that with many other traditions. We would differ from so many other evangelicals in this emphasis that God calls us. We don't find him, he finds us. Other distinctives that have emerged in the Reformed tradition are, we have a very distinctive understanding of the sacraments, what we think happens in baptism and what we think happens in communion. In that we disagree with Lutherans and with Catholics and with Wesleyans and lots of people. So we really do think that Jesus is genuinely present to us in the sacraments. We have a real encounter with him. But nothing happens to bread or wine, right? It's still bread, it's still wine, but we have this real encounter. And that's, I think, a very important and precious part of the Reformed tradition to me. Really our essential tenets try to lay out the essential distinctives of the Reformed tradition. Then evangelical just means sharing the good news, right? So the word evangelical is slippery. A lot of people claim it. Our current president, who is in no way evangelical, still calls himself an evangelical. So So it's become a word that a lot of people just take and make it mean whatever they want.
He's focus grouped it, so that's why he claims it, all right? So.
Whatever you think of him, he's not an evangelical. And he's certainly not a Presbyterian, which he also claims. He also told someone he has never confessed sin, and therefore you know he is not a Presbyterian, because we do that every week, right? So evangelical has become a really broad category, especially in the American church, but it's people who believe strongly in the authority of Scripture, believe that it is our calling to evangelize, to bring the good news into the world. People who say Jesus is the only way. Those are kind of evangelical distinctives. So, for instance, when my committee, I'm on the committee that interviews people. You elders got interviewed by a couple other people from my committee. I couldn't really be the interviewer because I'm, part of this. But I'm on that same committee. I go around and do that kind of interview with people too. So, if they did what they're supposed to do, if they followed the script, you got questions about being evangelical. And those would have been questions about, do you believe in the authority of Scripture, and how does Scripture function in your life? And do you do evangelism, and how do you share the gospel with people, and what does that look like? And then you also got questions about being reformed, and then they probably talk to you about, do you choose your salvation, or does God choose you? How sinful do you think you are? So both those things are part of the way we talk to folks when they come in. Is that good enough?
I think that's very helpful. Any questions or anything about that? You're right, evangelical is a very broad term applied in lots of different ways.
So I heard a few things. I heard a modern English version might be helpful for these. I heard we need to talk about the uses of these confessions, how they're going to be used in our church, how authoritative they are, especially if we're going to use them in worship. And then I've heard, what are our thoughts on the eco-denomination formulating their own, or as opposed to just adopting sort of the essential tenets as an authoritative body of work in our church?